The morning air in the diner was thick with the smell of sizzling bacon and stale coffee. Outside, the sun was still a weak promise on the horizon of the sleepy highway town. Inside, under the hum of fluorescent lights, a group of men occupied the largest booth in the corner. They were a contradiction to the cozy domesticity of the place, a wall of leather and steel in a world of formica and vinyl. Patches on their worn leather vests identified them as the Sentinels Motorcycle Club. They were large men, weathered by the road and time. Their faces were maps of hard miles and harder living, but their presence was not aggressive. They ate their breakfast with a quiet economy of motion, the clinking of their forks against ceramic plates the only sound they contributed to the diner's gentle morning murmur. At the head of the booth sat Ghost, the chapter president. His hair was more salt than pepper, pulled back in a tight tail. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, missed nothing. He chewed his toast methodically, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced passive surveillance. To his right sat Bear, a man built like a refrigerator, his massive arms covered in a tapestry of faded ink. Across from them, Doc, wiry and intense, stirred sugar into his coffee, his movements precise and controlled. Next to him was Crow, leaner than the others, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent, his phone resting face down on the table. They were just passing through a familiar ritual on their long rides. Find a local spot, get a hot meal, and be on their way before the town fully woke up. They attracted stares, of course, they always did. The other patrons, a handful of early-rising locals and a tired trucker, cast nervous glances their way, conversations dropping to whispers when a piece of cutlery clattered too loudly from the biker's table. The waitress, a teenager named Chloe, served them with a trembling hand and a practiced, brittle smile. The men of the Sentinels were used to it. They didn't mistake fear for respect, but they accepted it as a fact of life. Their appearance was a uniform, and society had already decided what that uniform meant. They didn't bother correcting it. They just ate their eggs, drank their coffee, and kept to themselves. The tranquility was shattered by the frantic jingle of the bell above the door. It wasn't the casual entry of a customer, it was a sound of pure panic. Every head in the diner turned. Standing in the doorway was a small boy, no older than 6 or 7. He was barefoot, his small feet pale and dirty against the checkered linoleum. His pajamas, adorned with cartoon rockets, were rumpled and thin against the morning chill. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and swimming with unshed tears. His chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. In one tightly clenched fist, he held a crumpled piece of paper. He stood frozen for a moment, his gaze darting wildly around the room. He looked past the trucker, past the couple in the next booth, past the wide-eyed waitress who had frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. His eyes landed on the corner booth, on the mountain of a man they called Bear. For a heart-stopping second, the boy just stared. The diner went completely silent. The only sound was the boy's desperate gasps for air. Then, with a surge of purpose that seemed impossibly large for his small frame, he ran. He didn't run to the waitress or the man by the counter who looked like he might be the owner. He ran directly toward the 4 intimidating bikers. He skidded to a halt beside the booth, his small body trembling. He looked up at Bear's impassive, bearded face. He held out his clenched fist, unfurling his fingers to reveal a crumpled, sweaty $5 bill. "Please," the boy choked out, his voice a tiny, raw whisper that nonetheless echoed in the tomb-like silence. "Please walk me home. My mom needs help." The other patrons stared, paralyzed by shock and uncertainty. The owner reached for the phone behind the counter but hesitated, his hand hovering. What was he supposed to do? What was the protocol for this? The Sentinels did not hesitate. Ghost's pale blue eyes met Bear's. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That was all it took. There was no discussion, no debate. The plea had been made. The call had been answered. Bear's huge hand, which could have crushed the boy's skull, gently closed over the boy's small fist, folding his fingers back over the useless money. His voice, a low rumble like shifting gravel, was impossibly soft. "Keep your money, kid. We got this." Without another word, all four men moved. They rose from the booth in a single fluid motion, the scrape of their boots on the floor seeming unnaturally loud. Ghost dropped a few 20s on the table, more than enough to cover the bill and a generous tip. He looked at the stunned waitress. "Call Sheriff Henderson. Tell him we're at 412 Maple Street." He didn't wait for a reply. He led his men out of the diner, Bear's hand resting gently on the small boy's shoulder, a silent promise of protection. The boy, whose name they would later learn was Leo, didn't flinch from the contact. He seemed to draw strength from it, his trembling lessening slightly as he guided them out into the pale morning light. The cool air was a shock after the warmth of the diner. Leo, still barefoot, pointed down the quiet residential street. "It's the yellow one," he said, his voice stronger now, "with the broken flower pot." They walked, a strange procession, 3 giants of men in leather and a small pajama-clad boy. They moved with a purpose that was unnerving, not fast but relentless. Forward, always forward. The town was still asleep, curtains drawn, the silence broken only by the soft pad of Leo's bare feet and the heavy, rhythmic tread of their boots on the pavement. They reached 412 Maple Street in less than a minute. It was a neat little house, the kind that was supposed to be a sanctuary, but the illusion of peace was shattered. A large terracotta planter on the porch was smashed, soil and red shards scattered across the steps. The front door was slightly ajar. From inside, they heard a man's voice, low and venomous. "You think you can defy me? You think you can embarrass me after everything I've given you?" It was followed by the sound of something glass shattering. Ghost held up a hand, and his men stopped at the edge of the lawn. He didn't need to give an order. Crow already had his phone out, his fingers flying across the screen, his face a mask of concentration. Doc shifted the medical kit he always carried on his belt to be more accessible. Bear simply stood, his massive frame radiating a dangerous stillness. Ghost took the lead, walking up the porch steps, carefully avoiding the broken pottery. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was exactly what he had expected, and exactly what he had feared. The living room was in disarray. A lamp was overturned, a picture frame lay shattered on the floor, and a vase of flowers had been swept from a table. In the middle of the chaos stood a man. He was dressed in khaki pants and a crisp, light blue polo shirt. He had neatly styled hair and a face that, under other circumstances, might have been called handsome. He looked like a golf pro, a respected member of the community. On the floor, huddled near a sofa, was a woman. She had her arms wrapped around her head, her dark hair obscuring her face. Her body was shaking. She was wearing a simple nightgown, and a dark, ugly bruise was already purpling on her upper arm. The man, Martin, turned as Ghost entered, his face contorting from a snarl of rage into a mask of surprised annoyance. He didn't see a rescuer. He saw an inconvenience. He saw a stereotype he could easily manage. "Can I help you?" Martin asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He straightened his polo shirt, trying to project an air of authority, of being the master of his castle. Ghost didn't answer. He simply stepped aside, allowing Bear, Doc, and Crow to file in behind him. They filled the doorway, a silent, imposing wall of leather and judgment. The room suddenly felt very, very small. Martin's eyes flickered between the four men, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his posture. Little Leo, who had been hiding behind Bear's leg, darted forward. "Mommy!" he cried, running to his mother's side. The woman, Sarah, looked up. Her face was pale and streaked with tears. When she saw her son, a fresh wave of fear washed over her. "Leo, no, get back," she whispered, trying to shield him with her body. Martin's focus snapped back to the bikers. His face hardened, the charming facade melting away to reveal the ugliness beneath. "I believe you were just leaving," he said, his voice low and tight. Ghost finally spoke. His voice wasn't a shout. It was quieter than Martin's, but it carried a weight that filled the entire house. "That's enough." 3 simple words, but they were not a request. They were a command. They were the drawing of a line. Martin scoffed, a short, ugly sound. He took a step forward, puffing out his chest. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private family matter. This has nothing to do with you, so I suggest you and your friends get back on your little toys and ride on before you get into real trouble." He was trying to reassert his dominance, to use his perceived social standing as a weapon against these road-worn outsiders. It was a bad choice, a very bad choice. Crow, who had been silent until now, looked up from his phone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Martin Peterson, age 38, regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. You drive a silver Lexus. You're 2 months behind on your car payments." Martin's smug expression faltered. He stared at Crow, his mouth slightly agape. How do you know that?" Crow continued, his voice flat and clinical. "You have 2 prior domestic disturbance complaints filed against you in the last 3 years, one in Richmond, one in Fairfax. Both times the charges were dropped after the alleged victim declined to testify. You have a pattern, Martin. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The last vestiges of the respectable polo shirt-wearing family man evaporated, replaced by the cold, reptilian predator underneath. Martin's face flushed a deep, angry red. His eyes, which had been trying for condescending, were now just cold and full of hate. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl. He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah, who was now holding Leo tightly. "This is my house. She is my responsibility. You have no right." He took another aggressive step forward, his hands clenching into fists. It was the final mistake. He was so focused on Ghost that he didn't see Bear move. Martin lunged, not at Ghost, but towards Sarah and the boy. "You little brat," he screamed at Leo. "You'll pay for this." He never made it. Bear's arm shot out, not in a punch, but in an open-handed block. His palm connected with Martin's chest. It wasn't a violent shove, but it had the force of a battering ram. The air left Martin's lungs in a loud whoosh. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and crashed into the wall, sliding down to the floor in a stunned heap. Bear stood over him, a silent, unmovable mountain. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message was clear. It's done. The entire confrontation had lasted less than a minute. It was clean, efficient, and utterly decisive. The threat was neutralized. Before we continue this story, take a moment. The world is full of Martins, men who hide their darkness behind a veneer of respectability. But it is also full of sentinels, people who refuse to look away. If you believe in the power of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, then show your support. Like this story, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who understands that courage often wears the most unexpected uniform. As Martin gasped for air on the floor, the biker's focus shifted instantly. The confrontation was over. The caregiving had begun. Doc was already moving, his years as an army medic taking over. He knelt beside Sarah, his demeanor changing from imposing biker to calm professional caregiver. "Ma'am, my name is Doc. I'm a trained medic. Can I take a look at you?" he asked, his voice gentle. He didn't touch her but waited for her permission. Sarah, still trembling, looked from the crumpled form of Martin to the calm, steady eyes of the man kneeling before her. She gave a shaky nod. Doc began his assessment, his hands moving with practiced skill, checking for injuries, his questions quiet and direct. "Does anything else hurt? Did you hit your head?" Meanwhile, Ghost approached the boy. He crouched down, bringing his large frame to Leo's level. He didn't smile, but his expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. "You were very brave, Leo," he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "You did the right thing." Leo, still clinging to his mother, peeked out at the formidable man. He looked at the patches, the leather, the weathered face, and saw none of the menace he'd been taught to expect. He only saw the man who had made the monster stop. Ghost looked from the boy to his mother. He met Sarah's frightened eyes, and his gaze was unwavering. "It's over," he said, his voice imbued with absolute certainty. "He won't touch you again. Not today. Not ever again." It wasn't just a promise. It was a declaration of a new reality. In that moment, surrounded by these four strangers who had appeared like avenging angels from a highway diner, Sarah began to believe it. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope ignited in her chest. The wail of a siren grew louder, and a few minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb. Sheriff Henderson got out of the first car. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a calm, no-nonsense air. He had been sheriff of this county for 20 years and had seen it all. He saw the bikers' vests, and his expression became wary. He walked up the porch steps, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Ghost," he said, his voice neutral. "Your waitress said there was trouble." "Henderson," Ghost replied, nodding. He stepped aside, giving the sheriff a clear view of the scene. The trashed room, a crying woman being tended to by one of his men, a terrified child, and a well-dressed man sitting dazed on the floor. The sheriff's experienced eyes took it all in. He knew the sentinels. They passed through a few times a year. They were loud and looked intimidating, but his deputies had never once had a real problem with them. They policed their own, paid their tabs, and didn't cause trouble. This, however, was a new situation. "What happened here?" Henderson asked, his gaze fixed on Martin. Ghost gave him the simple, unvarnished truth. "His boy came into the diner asking for help, said his mother was being hurt. We walked him home. Found him like this, he got aggressive. We stopped him." It was a sparse report, but it was all that was needed. Henderson looked at Martin, then at Sarah, who was now sitting up, Doc having given her an ice pack for her arm. He saw the fresh bruise, the fear in her eyes, and the relief that was slowly dawning on her face. He looked at the little boy hiding behind his mother, then back at the bikers. He had seen this story play out 100 times, but never with this cast of characters. His deputies moved in to deal with Martin, who had begun to find his voice again. "Sheriff, thank God you're here," he began, trying to summon his respectable citizen persona. These thugs broke into my house. They assaulted me." Sheriff Henderson just looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Peterson, we've had calls about this address before, calls you always manage to make go away." He turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, are you willing to give a statement this time?" Sarah looked at Ghost. He gave her a small, encouraging nod. She looked at Bear, who stood like a stone guardian by the door. She looked at her son, Leo, whose bravery had saved them. A new strength, borrowed from the men around her, began to flow through her veins. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, I am." That one word changed everything. It was the sound of chains breaking. Martin's face fell. The blustering stopped. He knew he had lost. As a deputy cuffed him, Martin's eyes found Sarah's. The mask was gone completely now, replaced by pure, undiluted venom. "You'll regret this, Sarah," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You can't hide from me. I'll be back, I promise you that." Before Sarah could even flinch, Ghost stepped directly into Martin's line of sight, blocking his view of her. He leaned in close, his voice a cold, quiet whisper that only Martin and the nearest deputy could hear. "No, you won't," Ghost said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they carried the weight of an oath. "You'll go away, and if you ever come back to this town or this county or even think about this woman and her son again, you'll find us waiting. And we're not as forgiving as the law." Martin's face went pale. In Ghost's cold, blue eyes, he saw a certainty that terrified him more than any jail cell. He saw a promise. The deputies led him away, his final threat dying in his throat. Later that day, the Sentinels were back at their clubhouse, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of a larger town miles away. The tension from the morning had dissipated, replaced by a low, simmering anger. The main room was large and Spartan, filled with a long wooden table, a worn-out sofa, and the smell of old leather and motor oil. Ghost stood at the head of the table where the club was gathered. He recounted the morning's events, his voice calm and factual. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. A younger member, a prospect named Ricky, shifted nervously. "So, what now, Prez? We gonna stick around? The cops have him." "It's their problem now." He was voicing the practical concerns, the risk of getting involved in a domestic dispute that was now officially a police matter. Ghost's gaze settled on him, not angry, but heavy. "The cops have him for now. He'll make bail. He'll get a lawyer. Men like him always find a way to slip through the cracks." His threat wasn't idle. He looked around the table at the faces of his brothers. "That little boy came to us. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the diner owner. He walked up to the scariest-looking men in the room and put his faith in us. We don't dishonor that. Ever." He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound cracking through the rooms like a gunshot. "This is not over. We will find her a new place to live. We will find her a job. We will make sure that man can never, ever find her. We will become a wall around them that he can't see, but that he will break himself against if he ever tries to get through. This is who we are. We protect those who can't protect themselves. Any questions?" There were no questions. Every man in the room nodded. The decision was made. The club's resources, their network, their money, their very presence, were now dedicated to Sarah and Leo. Word traveled fast in a small town. The story of the bikers in the diner, the barefoot boy, and the arrest of the respectable Mr. Peterson became the stuff of local legend overnight. Chloe, the young waitress, told everyone who would listen how the big, scary men had acted without a moment's hesitation. The diner owner told the story of Ghost calmly giving him the address and telling him to call the sheriff, not like a criminal, but like a partner. The fear the community had for the Sentinels began to curdle, transforming into a grudging respect and then quiet admiration. The diner owner put a jar on the counter with a handwritten sign, "For Leo and his mom." By the end of the day, it was overflowing with cash. The whole town, it seemed, wanted to help. They had been the frozen bystanders, and they were trying to make amends. The Sentinels, however, worked more quietly. Crow, using his particular set of skills, found a small, clean, two-bedroom apartment for rent in a town 50 miles away, owned by a cousin of another club member. The landlord was told only that a family in need was coming, and that their rent for the first 6 months would be paid in full. Hammer, the club's treasurer and a successful general contractor, called his office manager. He explained that he had a new hire for the front desk, a woman named Sarah. He told his manager to get the payroll paperwork ready and to expect her to start in a week. The club descended on the new apartment. They bought furniture, they stocked the fridge and pantry. Bear, the imposing enforcer, spent an entire afternoon assembling a child's bed shaped like a race car, his huge, clumsy-looking fingers surprisingly nimble with the tiny screws and Allen wrench. They installed new deadbolts and a simple but effective security system. They worked with the quiet efficiency of a military unit, each man knowing his job. A week later, Ghost and Bear drove Sarah and Leo to their new home. When Sarah walked in, she stopped dead in the entryway. The apartment was bright and clean. It was fully furnished, from a comfortable sofa to fresh towels in the bathroom. In the kitchen, a new coffee maker sat on the counter and the fridge hummed, full of food. Leo ran into the second bedroom and let out a whoop of pure joy. "A race car bed, Mom, look!" Sarah turned to Ghost, her eyes shining with tears, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of fear or pain. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. She couldn't speak. She didn't have the words to express the magnitude of what they had done. They hadn't just saved her. They had given her a new life, a clean slate. Finally, she found her voice. "Why?" she whispered, looking at the two imposing men who stood awkwardly in her new living room. "Why would you do all of this? For me? For Leo? We're strangers." Ghost didn't answer right away. He looked at Bear, who was staring at the race car bed with a strange expression on his face. He gave the big man a slight nod. Bear cleared his throat, the sound rough and unused. He looked at Sarah, his gaze direct and devoid of pity. "When I was Leo's age," he began, his voice a low rumble, "my old man. He was a lot like Martin, drank too much, had a mean temper. I used to hide in the closet listening to him yell at my mom, listening to the sounds. I was so scared, and I was so weak. I used to pray for someone, anyone, to come make it stop, but nobody ever came." He paused, the silence in the room heavy with the weight of his old pain. "We all got stories like that, more or less. Different closets, same monsters." Doc, who had come in behind them, spoke up from the doorway. "I had a sister," he said softly. "She married a man like that. I was overseas. By the time I found out how bad it was too late. I wasn't there to protect her." Ghost looked at Sarah, his pale eyes full of a deep, ancient sorrow. "We were all that little boy once, in our own way, scared, helpless, and alone. We made a promise to ourselves and to each other. We promised that if we ever got strong enough, no kid would ever have to feel that way again. Not on our watch. The road takes care of its own. And that day, Leo made you our own." The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. This wasn't charity. It was a sacred duty forged in the fires of their own childhood traumas. They weren't just helping a stranger. They were saving their younger selves. Leo came running out of his room, his face alight with pure happiness. He held up a piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing. It depicted a smiling woman and a small boy holding hands. Next to them stood a giant of a man with a big beard and a black vest. He was holding a shield, and a scribbled, angry-looking monster was shown bouncing off of it. He shyly walked up to Bear and held it out. "This is for you," he said. Bear, the man who could end a fight with one move, looked down at the childish drawing. He took it with a reverence he usually reserved for his motorcycle. He handled the flimsy paper as if it were the most precious object in the world. He looked at the drawing, then at Leo, and for the first time a genuine smile touched his lips, transforming his rugged face. "Thank you, Leo," he rumbled. "It's the best I've ever seen." 1 year passed, the seasons turned, and the memory of Martin Peterson faded into a cautionary tale in his old town. He had taken a plea deal, served a short sentence, and upon release had vanished, likely terrified of the Sentinel's quiet promise. In a bright, busy construction company office 50 miles away, Sarah worked at her desk. She was the office manager now, confident and efficient, her laughter often echoing in the hallway. She had cut her hair, and her eyes, once haunted, were now clear and bright. She was healing. She was thriving. After work, she drove to a local park to pick up Leo from his soccer practice. He ran to her, his face muddy and flushed with exertion, kicking a ball with his friends. He was no longer the terrified, barefoot boy in the diner. He was just a kid, happy and safe, his world full of sunshine and scraped knees, as it should be. Back at the Sentinel's clubhouse, a new object hung on the wall, in a place of honor, right beside the club's official charter. It was a simple black frame. Inside, under glass, were two things. One was a child's crayon drawing of a bearded giant protecting a mother and son. The other, carefully preserved, was a crumpled, sweat-stained $5 bill. It served as a permanent reminder, a reminder of a promise kept, a reminder of the day a little boy's desperate plea had led them to fulfill their truest purpose. The club had helped other families since, using the Leo Fund, as they'd come to call it, to provide safe passage for those fleeing their own monsters. The boy's courage had not just saved his mother, it had created a legacy. True heroes are not defined by the clothes they wear or the noise they make. They are defined by their actions in the moments that matter. They are defined by their choice to step forward when everyone else stands still. Real strength isn't found in a fist, but in a protective hand on a small shoulder. Sometimes the hardest-looking men carry the softest hearts, just waiting for a call they never expected to receive, a plea to simply walk a child home.